The House of Beautiful Business was inspired by the book that I wrote that came out, The Business Romantic, whose subtitle you refer to. And the business romantic was meant as an antidote to the prevailing philosophy at the time, which was this huge influence that Silicon Valley firms had over the rest of the world and the way we thought about business, but also the way we thought about life. And essentially the main argument that these big tech firms were making was that, I mean, to simplify it somewhat, we can engineer the world. We can engineer solutions to every single problem in the world, no matter how complex it is, including cultural, socio-political, philosophical issues. Engineering is the answer. And if we only have enough data and engineering smarts, we can optimize our behavior. We can influence and optimize our behavior, our human behavior, so that we become better versions of ourselves. And that argument was very compelling for many people. I think the big caveat was, and it's become more and more apparent, I think, in the past 5 to 10 years, was that it came at a very high price, which is that it kind of reduced us to these super quantified, ever so optimized machines. It treated us as almost like the targets of engineering, savvy, rather than acknowledging the full richness and complexity of being human. And it came at the very high price of compromising on our privacy, compromising on our data sovereignty. So all these platforms that appeared to be for free turned out to be not really free, because we consumers, we paid a very high price for it. And the influence that these companies accrued is tremendous. And it played out in the US presidential election and on many, many other occasions. I think there's been an acknowledgement that, yes, they've infiltrated societies in a way that's way too pervasive, way too powerful. So there's been a backlash against that. And my book, this is a long preamble to answer your question, but my book was kind of like almost like a rallying cry against this obsession with dataism and this digital Taylorism at the time. And on the heels of the book, we founded the House of Beautiful Business, because we felt like, okay, one thing is to write a manifesto or a book, but actually to really have more impact, let's form a community around it. And in the book, there's a line in the end that says, hey, by the way, there's a secret society called the Business Romantic Society. If you want to be a part of it, just send me an email. And it was a bit tongue-in-cheek, kind of like half joking, but then I actually got some emails, from people like, hey, I want to be part of this. And at some point I felt responsible for, okay, now this cannot just be sort of a stunt, this needs to be real. And then I called my old friend Till, whom I had worked with before, and we said, let's just do a gathering. The first one was in Barcelona in 2017. We rented an old guild house in the old town of Barcelona. We brought in 150 friends and acquaintances. Essentially, it was free, it was a passion project. And we hosted the first House of Beautiful Business gathering for 3 days. And it really struck a chord. We had opera singers, we had silent dinners, we had an exhibition. We talked about what business leaders can learn from the beautiful game of football. I mean, it was just such an interesting, eclectic, and very intuitive gathering, but it struck a chord and really resonated. And shortly thereafter, we decided, like, okay, let's, people need this, or some people need it. Let's turn this into actually a business. Let's turn it into a community. And from that point on, it has grown now to a global community of more than 25,000 sort of members, followers around the world, local hubs, and on every continent, in fact. And also we're doing projects together, members of this community. We do consulting work. We create experiences that are transformative to help individuals and teams to reinvent themselves and shape a more beautiful future for business and the world. But the flagship gathering with which we started is still there. So we will still we still have an annual gathering, and that's sort of the big meeting place, gathering place for the core of our community. We've been, as you know, Eda, we've been somewhat reluctant to codify it or to define it. We've always referred to this nice quote by the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, who said, "Beauty is what does not exist." and you can read this in two ways. You can read it in a way like, okay, it's a very fatalistic statement. Beauty just doesn't exist. The world is ugly. But that's not what he meant. What he meant was that beauty is so elusive and it's so aspirational that the moment you codify it, the moment you try to define it, it evades you, it escapes you, and it becomes less precious. Hence our reluctance. But at the same time, we are catering to a business community, and of course there need to be definitions and metrics. So for us, it means, I think on the higher level, it means business that is purposeful, inclusive, and sustainable. So purposeful as in serving a higher purpose, not just to make shareholders happy and make customers happy, but actually being a conduit between a higher meaning in the world, between people's needs for a sense of belonging and cohesion, and workplaces and organizations having the power and responsibility to provide that. Inclusive means increasingly acknowledging a broad range of identities, not narrowing us down to one version of ourselves that needs to show up again and again consistently. So gender fluidity, identity fluidity, cultural fluidity, a broader, richer version of ourselves. That's what it means to be inclusive, including people who have not had a voice yet in the shaping of the future and the business agenda. And then sustainable, of course, means being a business that is in tune with nature, that is not just like in for the short-term gain based on moments of mechanisms of extraction and exploitation, but actually regenerating, creating long-term value, building something that lasts. And I think maybe because you've asked, that's the biggest shift. When we started in 2015, when I wrote my book, in 2017, The First House, I think humanizing business or humanizing technology was kind of like the big cause against mainstream, right? So there was a lot of technology obsession, and as I mentioned before, so humanizing technology, humanizing business was something that seemed like a counter movement. And then we had a whole movement around purpose, saying it's not enough for business just to produce, to maximize shareholder value. They need to have a strong purpose and need to be contributors to society in a good way. But I think now, and the house has really evolved with this over time in our definition of beautiful business. Now, I wouldn't say beautiful business is business that is 100% human-centered. To me, it's business that is life-centered, so that acknowledges all life on Earth, that acknowledges animals, plants, nature, also spirituality, like a spiritual sphere, understanding that there's something very precious and beautiful and sacred about this life that surrounds us and that's been given to us, that we need to honor, not just convenience and making humans happy. It's a bigger view. And maybe that's been the biggest shift. But I think at the House of Beautiful Business, beauty for us also means that we are interested in this intersection between aesthetics and ethics. And it doesn't mean that everything is harmonious. To be beautiful also means to be ugly. It means to acknowledge like the dark side of ourselves, the shadows. But I think beautiful is something when it creates an experience that lifts our spirit, that transcends ourselves, that you can't quite describe in words, that makes you carried away, like falling in love, like being part of a effervescent, collective experience, like a rave or a football game or something that just takes over you when life kind of erupts in you. I think that's also beautiful. And we try very deliberately not just to create like meaningful moments that kind of pay dividends on purpose and inclusivity and sustainability, but also create deeply emotional experiences that are more raw, that connect us to something almost animalistic, that reminds us of something, of a force, of a life force that we have basically shut away from business, because management was all about the illusion of control. Like we need to control, we need to quantify, we need to manage, right? We need to contain it. And I think increasingly there's, at least the people in our community, we feel like, no, business needs to be more like life. But that also means life is wild, it's messy, it's archaic, so while of course there's an interest in managing that to some degree, otherwise organizations wouldn't be able to function, we need to become more natural. We need to allow for more messiness, for more chaos, for more emergence, for more messiness, for improvisation. And I think that's also ingrained in the and the DNA of what we define as beautiful business. So business that is more like life, business that is more alive, business that is more attuned with nature, business that makes you, that brings out the best in you. You know, that's beautiful business. Well, I think we're undergoing another great transformation now, and as always, when at these moments of transition, because it's essentially a pivotal moment of crisis, right? Like geopolitical fractures, the environment, the climate crisis, an increasingly fragmented, polarized world, right? So there's not one story, one narrative anymore. Extremism, you know, of all colors. Um, so the world is changing really fast and business is changing as well. But whenever you are in moments of these transitions, there's kind of almost like a backlash, or there's an undercurrent that pulls back and says, no, no, not so fast, right? Let's preserve the status quo. I think we saw this with Donald Trump in the US. You know, it's kind of like the agony of an old system, basically the white macho man, right, governing the world, knowing that their time is up, essentially, right? And kind of revolting against that. So well, I think we see this in business as well, that business, which has been run mostly by white men, you know, has to some degree been based on the principles of colonialism and extraction and exploitation at the core, is sort of, I think, seeing a reckoning. And of course, there's a lot of forces and people in power who do not want that to happen, who cling to the status quo and cling to their power. So I think it's a little bit of this like two steps forward, you know. So yes, there's a lot of ideas like the 4-day work week, hybrid work, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion policies at work, blockchain-based, decentralized decision-making, more democratic, participatory decision-making, a different kind of workplace cultures, an appreciation for health and well-being, especially after the pandemic. So social norms, right? The fact that you can you know, the whole LGBTQ conversation, which is really like, I know there's a lot of work still needs to be done, of course, in different parts of the world, but the social norms, one also has to acknowledge that they've actually changed quite a bit, and a lot has been accomplished compared to like 10, 20 years ago. And but it's always like a, you know, there's progress, and then I think the status quo and it is sort of pushing back. And I think what is still alive and what we see is there's still a very deep-seated fear, particularly in middle management. So the people who have to manage up to the high level senior executives and have to manage down and manage teams, I think they're kind of sandwiched in, and they fear loss of face. They fear for their job. They fear that they might be considered kind of eccentric fools if they venture out to fringe ideas. So they're always trying to come back and say, well, but at the end of the day, it's about the numbers, it's about the data, you know, business needs to make money. It's actually plain simple. So there's some very simple truths that I think managers often revert to. And we see this with clients that we work with, that they're kind of open, curious, and then you see cracks in their move. But then, you know, when there's the next sort of meeting, or often when they go back into their organizations, reality kicks back in for them, and they're like, that was too out there. Let's just sort of stick with you know, our tools. So that is still very much alive. You know, that fear is alive, and I think it will take many years to overcome that and create a new form of business where the majority of workers or knowledge workers is really comfortable with these new paradigms. Well, I think there's business can build muscle and help us gain new consciousness. There's an interesting initiative actually that came out of Sweden called the Inner Development Goals. Their founders are partners of the House of Beautiful Business, and they will also feature prominently at our next gathering. And the idea is to complement the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDG, with IDG, Inner Development Goals, to say that we can only accomplish these big societal shifts if we change ourselves, if we go inside and create resilience and openness and curiosity and empathy, and, you know, we look inside. And I think that's quite interesting, and I've talked about this earlier. This is a big shift where these ideas such as vulnerability, intimacy, empathy is actually practiced. I think we see more and more coaching. We see more and more spiritual or, metaphysical practices finding their way into business, on the edges, but it's creeping into mainstream. And mindfulness would have been laughed at 20 years ago. People meditating, yoga, sessions. The fact that you go to a business conference now, and it's, of course, there is sort of also a well-being offering, and the Harvard Business School offering new CEOs as part of their education in the first 3 days of this very focused program to really only reflect on their own well-being and health, understanding that that's their source. They can only inspire others if they understand and they're aware of their well-being and health, mental health as well, of course, not just physical health, all connected. So all of this is changing, and I think by changing the language and then changing some of the habits and the practices, I think ultimately we're changing the system, and we're changing the whole system of thinking and the way we define success, the way we measure success. So hopefully that's changing, more long-term thinking, more holistic thinking, and then also I think the way we rate performance or promote and reward will be defined differently than just it's profit driven or revenue driven, and what matters is the bottom line, justifying almost all means, which I think has been a huge issue. Yeah, I mean, what else? What's the alternative? I mean, I think it's hard though. And this year in particular, it's been really hard. So we thought, oh, we're just like this global village, all interconnected, sharing more or less universal values. And then Putin invaded Ukraine, which really changed everything. And it reminded us of the fragility of civilization in a way, at least Western civilization. And then there's been all these scandals, I think look at the crash of crypto and FTX. So this big marketplace turned out to was a huge, it was fraud, essentially. Sam Bankman-Fried, or also known as SBF, who was glorified, as like the new phase of decentralized finance and blockchain-based decision-making. So it's hard not to become cynical, isn't it? Because all of these new, great, glorified ventures suddenly turn out to be maybe not so great or problematic, right? And the same happened with Facebook, of course, and Twitter, Elon Musk now basically running Twitter into the ground and turning it into sort of a right-wing mouthpiece for him. I think that's really deeply concerning. So I think there's been very, very, very many instances this year that make you want to despair and actually feel like the damage that's been done, and actually the damage is growing and there's not even a chance to kind of fix it or contain it. But that just means in a way like giving up or putting the head in the sand. So I think we just need to uphold the flag of beauty and just, I mean, the one thing I believe in, maybe that's the only thing I believe in, and when it comes down to it, is I think humans basically want to be loved, and they want to love, and they are very inspired when they experience that, and it brings out often the best in them, if it's genuine, and that I really believe in. In terms of like the human condition and what humans are capable of doing and what their motives are. I wouldn't want to idealize, human beings, and we're definitely doing a lot of damage. So I think a lot of it will. Bayo Akomolafe, the Nigerian philosopher who spoke at the house last year and who's a philosopher in residence, he talks a lot about trauma and essentially saying that the first order of business for all of us, but specifically for business, is to heal. So we need to understand the damage we did, the injuries, the wounds that we inflicted, and we need to heal those. And we also need to give people going forward the tools and the practices to heal because there'll be a lot of healing that needs to be done. And business can be a powerful vehicle for that. So in that sense, I'm optimistic, and I see so many visionaries and ideas and people who really want to change things, and and actually when I come to the House of Beautiful Business, so when I see our community, they're also, it's not saying they're all like Mother Teresa, but they're all complicated beings. But I feel like there's a tenderness, and there's an openness, and there's love, and there's it gives me hope. Yeah. I mean, I think they're definitely structural. So I think they should read different books. And maybe not whenever I see these articles, oh, learn from Elon Musk how to read 35 books in 1 week, and absorb a lot of knowledge, go to Blinkist or Get Abstract and read the short summary. You don't need to read the whole book, just absorb. This is exactly this optimization ideology that I mentioned earlier. And so, yeah, they read a lot of books, but they never understand one. They're not really going deep. And there's no moral, sentimental education of the heart, of ethos. This is what Kara Swisher, who's a former New York Times journalist, now with Vox Media, always says. The problem of big tech is not that they're evil. The problem is that they have no sense of ethics because they haven't learned it. So they don't even know what the implications and the consequences are of their doing. They think they're doing the right thing and they're changing the world for the better without seeing the complexity of their actions. So I think that's one thing. I think we just need a different education, and it's one. And then I think the second issue is definitely toxic masculinity. I think if you look at Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Sam Bankman-Fried, Donald Trump, Peter Thiel, there's so many investors and billionaires and visionaries, so-called visionaries, who have just been brought up in a system that still rewards sort of a certain assertive behavior, kind of like a me against us, me against the rest of the world mentality. And even for Elon Musk, it really is something that bothers me, is that when he makes these really often demeaning remarks, through his tweets, and it's sort of, there's still so much like fandom, there's so many people, even people I know in my bubble, who are critical of him, but they're like, but that was kind of cool, like that was sort of a funny joke, and he's so fearless. And so they're in the same, and it's exactly the same thing that happened with Trump or any sort of other authoritarian figure. It's kind of like this, yeah, they're not right, but there's something fascinating about their rigor and their sort of unconditional, right, sort of belief in themselves that we find deeply fascinating and that we're attracted by. So this is a bigger cultural change where we need to teach men in particular, I think, but of course everybody, to appreciate softness and tenderness and kindness, and also being wrong, and acknowledging failures and talking about your emotions. This to me is key to changing the system. This is also why we at the house always come back to emotions and always come back to intimacy, because we feel like at the end of the day, it's the psychology of human being that is the crux of it all, rather than a certain policy or a certain process or a certain tool, or whether it's like online, offline, or I think it's our psychology, it's our psyches and our emotions and how we feel the world and relate to the world that is the source of it all. It's interesting also Mastodon, which is created like out of Berlin as a decentralized federation of servers. Jack Dorsey's new initiative and many other Web3, so-called Web3 initiatives. I think they're kind of going back to the original idea of the internet, which was it's basically self-governed, it's democratic, it's decentralized, it's not owned by a private entity, and it's not a walled garden like Facebook or Twitter to some degree. So Wikipedia is maybe the best example of that version of the internet. I think it holds promise. I think, to be honest, I'm not really an expert in any. I haven't really dabbled much with these platforms. I find them very hard to understand. And whenever I read about blockchain and Web 3.0 and decentralized web, often I read a white paper and on page 2, I don't understand it anymore because the language is so jargony. And I think also in terms of crypto or cryptocurrency deliberately so that, you know, so that there is this suggestion of like, wow, it's this cult and it's a super cool thing and you have to be in the know and you have to acquire the jargon. Often it's to protect or to shield a very simple truth that many of these platforms are basically just Ponzi schemes. So yeah, I think structurally it holds a lot of great potential, but I'm just not sure. I just read a column the other day, I think it was in the New York Times, saying the problem is still that many of these Web 3.0 technologies, they've done one thing really well. They have made a few people really rich because they're basically speculations. But we're still struggling to find a real use case for it, you know, for sort of tokenization. And even with the house, we many times thought about, should we tokenize our community? Should we create our own currency? Should we create a decentralized autonomous organization? So a blockchain-based organization where through smart contracts, people can make decisions collectively. But whenever we really explored it, we realized now we don't actually need it. It makes things much more complicated. Everything is already in place to do that. It's more about our will and it's more about power and than it is about the actual structure. So yes, there's promise, but I think this year in particular, with everything that happened in the past few weeks, I think has been a huge kind of moment of disillusion. And it'll take some time, I think, to recover from the failure of FTX and all the, you know, disenchantment and frustration that will bring, you know, that will come with it. Yeah, we did an asynchronous conference, and it was like the first time we did it. We did it on Discord, so a community channel, a server for like conversation, and it was really interesting. So we held these sessions. We had audio and video contributions from experts, and then we had this ongoing conversation on Discord. And it was really great because actually it's a great way to learn that you don't have to do everything in real time. You can go back in and reflect, and then a few days later you meet people to discuss something that happened 3 days ago, and you're accumulating and building this repository of knowledge. And so the big question was, can we make Web 3.0 beautiful? So is it only going to be more efficient? And but what does it mean to make it beautiful? And then so inclusive, sustainable, purposeful. And we had a lot of different perspectives. And I think the fundamental clash is always, will it become so commercialized so quickly that there's no room to create a space for more than just like strict commercial agendas? And will that cheapen the potential and essentially destroy it, as we've seen with many other web versions before? And then the second question that I think is always hotly disputed is, well, do people really want this? Like, is that a good human experience to be on Web 3.0 in DAOs or in the metaverse? Or is that just something that big corporations impose on us when in fact there's not even a need for it? Myself, I'm deeply, deeply skeptical. I read all the numbers. There's a lot of hype and investments going into the metaverse. I know that Decentraland, there was this famous article saying the average daily user at some point was like 400, 500 people are actually in this virtual world. And the experiences I had myself in virtual worlds, I mean, some of the games and the immersive stuff is fascinating, but I also am glad to be out there after 30 minutes. And some of the worlds that we even had built for ourselves for the house, we did this too as part of our virtual festival. They were cute. I mean, but would I really want to meet a friend there, or rather go into a real forest or a great city? It's not even close. So I think right now I don't see any particularly compelling use case for it, to be honest. So I'm skeptical. I don't think Web 3.0 or Web 3 or the metaverse is going to save the world. Today is an interesting day, right? So it's December 16th, and I just read that Elon Musk decided to suspend the accounts of a few journalists, actually high-profile journalists on Twitter, who had been critical of his ownership. And I think it's interesting, at the same time, the New York Times still directs traffic to Twitter. So every article, right, has this icon and with the prompt to share on Twitter. And I think it just sort of raises the question, who has the power, really? Like, if we all deleted our accounts on Twitter, Twitter would be dead, you know? And I think a lot of people are leaving right now. And I think I will too. I just decided this for myself. I wanted to see how it's going to play out. You know, I have sort of moderate following, like 7,000 people, you know, something. I really enjoyed being there. I like the medium. I like the pace of it, the directness of it. But I think I'm kind of done. You know, it seems like it's really spiraling out of control. And this does raise the question, like, do you need social media in your life? I pretty much like withdrew from Facebook like a couple of years ago. I rarely post, and if I post, then only like honestly like to promote stuff. I don't really use it to stay in touch with friends. I post occasionally on Instagram, but it's more my own sort of collection of images and memories, to be honest. It's nice to have this. Of course, it's nice to have this oxytocin kind of, you know, instant gratification kick, like, oh, someone recognizes your life, right? And it validates your life by, you know, someone acknowledging that you spent like the weekend on a yacht in, you know, on a Greek island or something. But I don't know. I think it's a really interesting question whether our life is actually better with social media. You know, there's so much research that it does enhance mental health issues and loneliness and depression among teenagers, not only teenagers. So I don't know. I think so far, I mean, there's all these arguments, of course, that social media has helped activism and has helped drive political change. And I think there's many, many use cases, of course, for social media driving or propelling social change. But as an individual, and in terms of my own well-being and that I know, I just don't know if it has actually really contributed anything good. So would my life be better without social media? Probably yes. And I think Ezra Klein, a New York Times columnist, said something interesting. He said, you know, what social media have done so far is to absorb our attention. And basically that's what we're paying with, right? We pay with our attention. It has fragmented our attention. And it's time actually to think of social media, or it's time for social media platforms, new social media platforms, to give back to us, to give us attention, to pay attention to us rather than just absorbing our attention and then in a way like eliminating our attention. So maybe that's the idea behind the new Mastodon, you know, federated, decentralized social media platforms. I don't know. I think we're at a real moment of scrutiny whether the world really needs social media and, you know, what the path is going forward. That's interesting. I've never really thought about this. What you just said, that that even failed startups with all the IP they're building and the processes and the data that they're collecting and then actually supposed to delete, but there's of course knowledge being generated that's passed on and that becomes part of the ecosystem. Yeah, it is. It is in a sense digital labor that is often unpaid and often done by volunteers, or it's paid at absolute minimum pay. It is the new digital Taylorism, right? Or there is certainly an element of digital of exploitation for sure. I think it's interesting. I mean, let's look at Wikipedia, for example, which is run by volunteers following pretty strict guidelines, editorial guidelines. And here it's really a matter of intrinsic motivation, right? So it's idealistic contributors believing that they can contribute to a resemblance of truth, you know, through collective intelligence. Let's put it that way. So they're intrinsically motivated and they contribute. And sort of that is the reward for them, right? That they actually have impact. And so it's not always, the compensation, of course, is not always cash, it's not always financial. It's also status, reputation, purpose, meaning. And that is also a currency, of course, that matters. And many of those digital communities are rewarded through such currencies. But at the end of the day, of course, the question of precariat or precarious, a new sort of, you know, class precarious class of digital workers is depends on the financials or the financial compensation. I think the only way out is, I mean, the fundamental problem is, of course, that we do not own our data and that we have given up our data sovereignty in many cases. And there's been so many attempts, I think, by various organizations and startups to create a marketplace where we have data sovereignty, where we can carry our data from platform to platform, and as creators or micropreneurs, whatever you want to call it, own our data and are rewarded for actually lending our data to platforms that then analyze and optimize based on the data that we provide. So that's the vision in a way behind some of these Web 3.0, of course, platforms and it's also by tokenizing it, right? So that you own your data, you participate, you give, you receive a token, and by receiving a token, you participate in the upside of a platform if it's doing well. So that is, in theory, I think, an interesting model. I think I said earlier in our conversation that I was somewhat skeptical of these, currencies and alternative models. But in theory, I think it's quite a compelling and perhaps inevitable path that we, democratize again, that we grant data sovereignty and that we own our data. And then whenever we create digital artifacts, rewarded for it. NFTs is the same, right? So that in a way, the same principle, that there are virtual assets that we can own and buy and trade. So there is a whole new marketplace that I think is acknowledging that sort of imbalance. However, many of the statistics point to the fact that there is a new divide, right? So of course, NFTs are owned by people who already are pretty affluent, right? As sort of a new hobby, a new way of speculating. And then I think in terms of cryptocurrencies, we've also seen that, like with the mortgage crisis, the subprime mortgage crisis in the US, apparently also a lot of these new virtual assets are often sold to people who actually have not been aware, of the potential downsides, right? So they were sort of desperate. They jumped on the new currency. They thought it was a great way of investing. Often they're victims of fraud, and it's often communities who already don't have real access, or the knowledge really to understand the mechanics of a digital marketplace. So I'm not an economist and I'm not a policymaker, and I don't really have sort of a silver bullet. But I think the answer probably lies somewhere in this mix of decentralized web, new currencies, and data ownership, if we want to really overcome that problem. So I'm just right now in the middle of writing a proposal for the book, before even starting the actual research on the book. And it's been a long time in the making, and I've thought about this for a long time. So my first book came out in 2015, and it was about a revival of romanticism in response to dataism, if you will. And then I wrote a book in German that came out in 2020 about the end of winning, like the lost art of losing. And now I want to go a little bit deeper, and I think we're at a really interesting moment in time where we see the emergence of virtual worlds, of simulations, the metaverse, and at the same time, because of the pandemic and the climate crisis, there's a real desire to reconnect to nature, to our own nature, to natural resources, to be earthy. And we also understand that in order to fix some of the pressing societal changes and species changes of our time, we need to heighten our consciousness. And increasingly we see psychedelics, other mind-altering experiences becoming mainstream, microdosing, at the workplace and so forth. Even The Economist wrote about microdosing becoming a trend, in certain workplaces, where there's a renaissance of spirituality. I think there's an acknowledgement of what appear to be esoteric practices, energetic healing, energy frameworks. So yoga was considered weird maybe 20 years ago. Now it's very much mainstream. And I think all of these sort of esoteric practices, the marriage of ancient technology, ancient wisdom, and new technology is sort of coming to the fore. And that's what I want to explore. I call it the rise of the metaphysical economy. So an economy that is very grounded in the physical, in the body and the flesh and the soil, and is much more like life, and attuned to life, and at the same time an economy that goes to the highest purpose and the highest spheres and to a heightened level of collective consciousness, that maybe understands the bigger picture more so than this very narrow self-interest, individualistic notion of capitalism that we've had. And I write this book not as a shaman because I'm anything but, and not as someone who is particularly experienced with these experiences. I'm actually a very like conservative, not a conservative. I'm an open-minded skeptic, and grew up in a very like controlled, class, safe, sort of environment in Germany. But I've been privy to some of these experiences throughout the years, and I've met a lot of people, and I know it is coming. I know there's a revolution happening in the way we do business and the way we live our lives is fundamentally changing. And I just want to observe it, and I'll talk to the pioneers in that space and the people who are driving this too. And I want to present it and make sense of it in a way that someone like me, would read the book and think, oh, okay, so maybe I should give this a chance, or maybe there is indeed maybe this is something I need to also become curious about, and I'm not cynical about these things. So that's the gist of the book, and it's a bit of a stretch for me, but that's also what makes it interesting. I write books because I want to learn about things rather than rehashing something that I've known all along. I mean, I write for the reader as well, but it's a learning journey for me.